Just so nobody thinks this is bait, this has already been confirmed by the graphic designer over on Twitter that this was an April Fool's joke. However, when you talk about Resident Evil remakes, Resident Evil 1 comes up quite frequently, so just for the sake of conversation and this video, let's pretend for a brief moment that Resident Evil 1 Remake is a thing, and let's discuss it. Resident Evil 1 actually holds a very special place in my heart because it was the very first Resident Evil game that I played when the remake launched on the GameCube in 2002. I believe I was 13 at the time, and I had played some survival horror games in the past, the Alone in the Dark games from the 90s, Dino Crisis on the PlayStation 1. However, this was my first introduction into Resident Evil, and let me tell you, I actually had to stop playing the game for about 2 years because I got too scared. I bought the game when I was visiting my sister, and the couch that I was sleeping on the entire weekend that I was playing the game, I couldn't sleep because I was terrified that a zombie was going to come over the couch, since the couch wasn't pushed up against a wall, and was going to bite me in my sleep. So I literally stayed awake until the sun rose so that I could feel confident falling asleep because, you know, zombies are afraid of sunlight, obviously. So I stopped playing it for about 2 years until Resident Evil 0 came out, and I rented the game with my cousin, and he actually watched me play through the entire game in one weekend. And in that weekend, I realized, oh, I actually feel a lot safer? Is that the right word? Playing the original Resident Evil game now. So I went back and played it, and it became, and still is, my favorite Resident Evil game of all time. Don't get me wrong, there's been other great games in the series, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 4, etc., are all great games, but Resident Evil 1, maybe because of nostalgia, has always held a special place in my heart. So if it was confirmed to be getting a remake akin to Resident Evil 2, 3, and Resident Evil 4, I wouldn't complain, and I would play it like crazy, but at the same time, I don't feel it's really necessary. To me, the Resident Evil remake, especially the remastered versions that have come out on like Steam and the newer consoles, still holds up today. Yes, you can make the argument that the fixed cameras and some of the control schemes are very dated, but with the modern controls that they added to the remaster version, I find them easier than ever to play, and this is someone who grew up with tank controls. Also, the fixed camera adds a sort of mystery and a really unique horror element to the game that, while not saying this is bad, is kind of lost when you have the over-shoulder camera like in Resident Evil 2 and 4. Resident Evil 1 Remake just added so many great story elements to the game. My favorite part being Lisa Trevor. Every time I stream Resident Evil 1 over on Twitch, I always go through all the notes when it pertains to Lisa Trevor because I just find her whole story very tragic and extremely interesting and one of the better parts of the game. It's a great setup for people who are just getting into Resident Evil and invites them into the lore in a really great and scary way that, in my opinion, while some of the newer games, the new remakes, still have that horror element to it, it just was never the same as Resident Evil 1. Now, there are many arguments that could be made about how a remake could improve it and make it a better game overall, which again is why I don't think it's necessary, but I'm not against the game being remade. You could add a lot more to Lisa Trevor herself. I saw one person on Twitter, I'm sorry, I didn't save the post, so I don't have it here, but someone suggested Lisa Trevor pursuing you through the mansion. I don't hate the idea. It's just, I feel like that's been overdone at this point. You had Mr. X chasing you in Resident Evil 2. Nemesis should have been chasing you in Resident Evil 3 Remake. I mean, they had the blueprints right there after Resident Evil 2 Remake, but instead they just made him a scripted, essentially on rails chase that was just such a miss. How do you miss that? And then in Resident Evil 7, somewhat you can have Jack Baker following you around the mansion for certain parts. So not a bad idea. I think it's been done enough. But you could also go back and you could implement maybe parts of Resident Evil 0 into the story with Rebecca. She never even acknowledges the events of Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1 Remake. So maybe they could implement more of that. They could maybe flesh out Wesker's backstory Maybe you could, I know there was a fan remake where you actually started in the star's office before going to the mansion. So there's definitely ways they could expand and improve on the story. And also getting to explore the mansion, even though I love the fixed camera angles, getting to explore the mansion with the over-the-shoulder camera would be a really fun and interesting experience. Going down those dark hallways, maybe you have to have a flashlight in some areas. Maybe, you know, maybe the power goes out, lose candles, whatever. Definitely having that over-the-shoulder look, that intense, almost kind of smothering feel that you would have going down those dark corridors in almost pitch black with zombies and hunters around every corner, could be a very fun and interesting experience and a fun new twist on it, especially if they bring the Crimson Heads back. Well, why would they get rid of the Crimson Heads? But the Crimson Heads in that view would be really fun and really cool. Fighting Yawn, fighting, or finding, oh, maybe Forrest. Now, I'm just thinking this off the top of my head. Maybe if they wanted to have a pursuer, instead of it being Lisa, they could have Forrest have an expanded role in the Resident Evil remake. Again, I do think that idea is overdone, but it's something they could do. That could be really fun. There are ways to expand all this and I guess make it more approachable for the newer audience to Resident Evil who maybe still just can't get into the fixed camera or the tank/modern controls of the remaster that's out on Steam. Like I said, I do see all the arguments for it. I just think that there are other games, as I've talked about in other Resident Evil videos on this YouTube channel, that should have priority over Resident Evil 1. As I've said multiple times, I wish the next remake was going to be Code Veronica. Still have my fingers crossed for that, but I have a strong suspicion that it's going to end up being Resident Evil 5. Maybe if we're lucky, we'll get both, even if they're like a year apart or whatever. But I also think they would release Resident Evil 9 in between those. Yet, as I've said in other videos, setting up Chris and Wesker's backstory with Code Veronica leading into Resident Evil 5 remake would be a lot better and give them even more room to expand the story that we've already known. A Resident Evil 1 remake is not a bad thing. Not something I would complain about. I would stream it like crazy. I would play it nonstop. I know I would absolutely love it. As I said, Resident Evil 1 remake is still my favorite Resident Evil game of all time. I would happily welcome it. I just don't feel it's absolutely necessary. Yet, with that being said, if they ever announce it, yes, I will freak out and I will be super happy. So I guess I'm just a hypocrite. I can live with that. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you think Resident Evil 1 should be remade now, maybe after Code Veronica 5, 9, whatever. Let me know down below, and thanks for watching.